Hello everyone, my name is Jennifer and welcome to Best Kept Plans. Today's video is going to be a reading recap for January 2024. If you're interested in seeing that, please stick around. As I said in my introduction, today's video is going to be a reading recap for January 2024. Before we get into the books that I read last month, I did just want to give a little bit of a life update. I haven't stuck to my usual posting schedule here on YouTube since the beginning of February, and I actually took a little bit over a week off from posting on Instagram as well. And the reasoning behind that is because my father passed away in early February 2024. He was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's disease a little over 3 years ago. And unfortunately, with early onset Alzheimer's, it tends to progress very quickly. And in the last few months, he has really been not doing very well and suffering, and he did end up passing at the beginning of the month. My family is really trying to focus on him no longer suffering anymore, and where he is, him having his voice back, because one of the first things that Alzheimer's took from him was his ability to speak. And my father was always someone who liked to be the center of attention, the life of the party, cracking jokes, making people laugh. So we're really trying to focus on him having the ability to do that again where he is now. So I am feeling now like I'm in a place where I can record again, and I'm feeling, like I have the energy and the inspiration to start recording videos again. So for the rest of February, you're going to see that I'm going to be posting some videos that I normally would have posted at the beginning of the month, like the January 2024 reading recap that you're watching now, but also my January 2024 budgeting recap and my February 2024 TBR. So be on the lookout for those videos in the next week or so. For this January 2024 reading recap, I'm going to be referencing my Archer and Olive Sarah Cray reading journal. I absolutely love this reading journal. I do have a couple of videos here on YouTube. One of them is a flip through of the setup for this reading journal. I also have a plan with me for my January intro pages as well as my February intro pages if you're interested in taking a look at those. I'm going to be using this journal to reference the different ratings that I gave books that I read throughout the month. And let's get into it. Let's dive into the books that I read in January 2024. The first book that I read, I actually released a reading vlog for here on YouTube. That was my first ever reading vlog. I do want to record more reading vlogs. I want reading vlogs to be a normal part of my upload schedule, but with life, I just have not gotten around to recording another one yet, but I am hoping to do so soon. And that first book that I read this year in January of 2024 was Powerless by Lauren Roberts. I definitely heard a lot about this book towards the end of 2023, and I ended up picking it up but deciding to hold off on reading it until January. I really wanted this to be the first book that I read this year, and I'm so glad that I ended up doing that because I really, really enjoyed this book. I really enjoyed our main characters. I liked the overall plot of the story. I could tell making my way through this that we had our story for this book, but we definitely had a plot point that was going to allow this to become a series, and I'm definitely very interested in continuing on with the series when more books are released. It didn't give me a 5-star feeling, but it was very, very good. I ended up giving this 4.5 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read in January was a review copy that I was fortunate enough to be sent by Simon & Schuster. So thank you to them so much for sending me Maude Horton's Glorious Revenge by Lizzie Pook. I immediately fell in love with the cover of this book, and I knew it was historical fiction, which is something that I don't read often, but have enjoyed when I've read it. And so I was very curious about this, and this ended up being a really great read. It has elements of mystery to it. It has adventure elements to it, but at its core, I really feel like this book is a story about the love between sisters, love between siblings, and I really enjoyed and appreciated that aspect of the story. I ended up giving this 4 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read in January 2024 was my Instagram challenge book for January. I have been doing an Instagram challenge for the last few years. Every month I read one book that was recommended to me by someone on Instagram, and the book that I read in January was A Not So Me Cute by Meghan Quinn, which was recommended by Alex at Artsy Reads and Plans. I have been reading recommendations from Alex for the last few years in my Instagram challenge, and she never picks a bad one, let me tell you. This is a romance. It was my first straight romance of the new year. I immediately liked it. It wasn't, to me, a perfect romance, but I thought that the characters were interesting on their own. I thought that the characters were interesting together. I liked how they worked through their dynamic as the story progressed, and I ended up giving this 4 out of 5 stars. It is a series of 3 books, each of which is centered around a brother in this family called the Kane family. So this first book was about the oldest brother, and then the second book is about the middle brother. The third book is about the youngest brother. So reading this one, I was definitely intrigued enough that I wanted to continue on with the series. Next, we have a book that actually recently got released. I'm recording this on February 16th, and this book actually came out earlier this week on February 13th, and that is Magnolia Parks Into the Dark by Jessa Hastings. I was fortunate enough to get a review copy of this book in January, so I was able to read it early. This is definitely one of my most anticipated releases for 2024. I read the Magnolia Parks universe in 2023, and the second Magnolia Parks book, third book in the Magnolia Parks universe, was my favorite book that I read last year. So I was very, very excited to dive back into the world of Magnolia and BJ. And I'm holding here the review copy that I was fortunate enough to get from Dutton. So thank you so much to them for this. But all the other copies of the books in the series that have already been released, I have in the UK covers. So I did end up purchasing the UK cover for the new book. I love this cover. I think it's gorgeous. So I'm very happy to have this one in my collection. I did really enjoy this book. I would say this book is very different from the other 2 Magnolia Parks books in the Magnolia Parks universe. This one is definitely much more dark. It deals with grief throughout the entire story. So much of the story is focused on grief, on going through the grieving process, how that looks, what that can manifest itself as for different people, how different people grieve in different ways. And I really feel like Jessa Hastings took so much care with that subject matter, which I really appreciated. I didn't feel like this was a 5-star book for me, and I really think that that's because of some stuff that happens towards the end of the story. Very specifically, there's an important event that happens at the end of the story, and with how beautiful Jessa Hastings' writing and quotes have been throughout this series, I was just looking for a little bit bit more in some very important words that our main characters said to each other. And that really, for me, is what dropped this from a 5 to a 4.5 out of 5, which ended up being my final rating. What I will say is we are going to be getting more Daisy Hates books in the Magnolia Parks universe, and a couple of little breadcrumbs that were left for us in this book with regards to our characters in those Daisy Hates books made me desperately want them now and want to read them now. So very much looking forward to continuing in this universe. The next book that I read in January 2024 was definitely a bit of an unexpected one for me. This is another review copy that I was fortunate enough to get from Simon & Schuster, so thank you again to them for this, and that is The Bullet Swallower by Elizabeth Gonzalez James. This book was one that I was definitely a little bit nervous for. It is also historical fiction, but it's kind of a Western style historical fiction, and I've never read anything like that before. What I will say is I enjoyed this book at every part and aspect of the story. I was thoroughly intrigued by this. I found the characters to be so interesting. The storyline was super interesting. It is a bit of an adventure story. It is definitely a Western, but it's also a generational story, a story about generational trauma, a story about striving to be better and to do better than the examples that you've had set for yourself. And I laughed, I cried, I was deeply moved by this book and gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars. I highly, highly, highly recommend it. The next book that I ended up picking up was another romance. After reading Magnolia Parks and then The Bullet Swallower, I felt like I needed something that was just a little bit lighter. And so I decided to actually pick up the second book in the Kane Brothers series, which is So Not Meant to Be by Meghan and Quinn. Unfortunately, I didn't have as much success with the second book in the series. The second book revolves around our middle Kane brother, but it also has a female main character who is sisters with the female main character in the first book. And so you meet her in the first book, and I actually really, really loved her character in the first book. I thought that she was very level-headed. I thought she was a really great sounding board for the female main character in the first book. I thought that she was very rational, and she really helped our female main character to see things from a different perspective, which was really important and beneficial for the main character in that first book. But unfortunately, in this book, I feel like the author completely changed her personality and made her nothing like how she was as a background character in the first book. And that was really the biggest issue I had with this one. I felt like her character got changed so drastically, and not in a good way, that it made it really challenging to enjoy this story. I did think the romance was cute. I did think there was some nice aspects or elements to the story, but overall this one was just kind of a little meh for me. And so I ended up giving it 3 out of 5 stars. The next book that I picked up was one that I had actually started way at the beginning of the month. If you watched that reading vlog that I put out for Powerless, I also talked about One in a Millennial by Kate Kennedy. This is a book that I received as an ARC through NetGalley, and it is nonfiction, and so I decided that I was going to pick it up and read it in between reading other books throughout the month. It is written in essay format, which I've found I appreciate most when it comes to nonfiction. I am a millennial myself, and this book is clearly for millennials. It is written by a millennial, and while I do feel like people in other generations could definitely enjoy this story, it is totally written for us millennial gals. It really, really is. I appreciated the nostalgia in this book. Like, it just brought up so many hysterical things about my childhood and my teenage years that I kind of forgot about, and I love that book for this. It also really tried to tie in those things into subjects and topics that are important today, which I appreciated that the author, Kate Kennedy, was able to do. Nonfiction is never going to be my favorite thing, but I did enjoy my time reading this and ended up giving it 3.5 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read in January 2024 was another anticipated release for the year, and I was fortunate enough to get a review copy of this book from Tor, so thank you so much to them for sending this to me, and that is The Atlas Complex by Olivie Blake. This is the third book in the Atlas series. I read the other 2 books and thoroughly enjoyed both of them and was really, really looking forward to seeing how this series was going to be closed out. Olivie Blake definitely, at least in this series, has some challenging writing. It's a little bit pretentious, which I really actually enjoy in this story. I think it works very well for the subject matter and for the characters that we have in this story, but it definitely takes me a little bit longer to get through. And so I did take my time with this one. I tabbed it a little bit as I was reading it because there were just some really fantastic quotes in here. I really ended up feeling like this was such a wonderful ending to this series. Like, I don't think this ending could have been done better. And that's not to say that we have a happy ending, because that's not the kind of story that this is. But I just really loved what Blake did with our characters, and I loved it. I just loved it. I think it was a great way to finish out this trilogy, and it makes me want to dive in more to Olivie Blake's writing. I have a couple of her other books, I just haven't picked them up, and after reading this one, I want to make that a priority this year. I want to read more Olivie Blake this year because I love this so much. I ended up giving this 5 out of 5 stars. This was my first 5-star read of 2024. The next book that we're going to talk about was an ARC that I received a physical copy of from Simon & Schuster. So thank you again to them. They were really, really good to me in the month of January. This book came out on February 6th, so it is available to you if you're interested in it, and that is Set for Life by Andrew Ewell. This is a contemporary fiction, literary fiction story. I remember getting an email from Simon & Schuster with a bunch of books and reading about this one and being immediately intrigued by it. But by the time I ended up picking this up, I could not remember what this book was about. And I'm glad that I didn't, because I actually really ended up enjoying going into it blind. This is a story that I think is a little bit challenging to talk about, like to describe to people, especially in a way that would make someone want to pick this up and read this, because I feel like really at its core, this book is about what happens when a terrible person makes bad decisions for their life and what that can do to someone's life, how their life can unravel very, very quickly. In that way, it almost reminds me of a book that I read a long time ago that I absolutely love called The F Up. That book was also kind of about a guy who just made terrible decisions for his life and his life just completely unraveled. And this is that kind of story. We get him making terrible decisions, but thinking that they're good ideas. And then we also, at the point where you're almost frustrated with how obnoxious and annoying and irresponsible and out of control this character is, the story does flip and we see his life kind of just taking a deep dive, and in a weird, perverse way, it's like enjoyable to like see how down in the dirt he is. And I don't know if that says something about me, but I did actually really enjoy reading this. I thought the writing was great. It definitely had me hooked, and it had me not wanting to put it down, and I ended up giving it 4 out of 5 stars. The last book that I read in January 2024 was a book of poetry. Poetry was something that I tried to make a priority in 2023, and while I'm not doing a poetry challenge this year, I do want to continue reading poetry. So I decided to pick up a book of poetry by who I would say is my favorite poet at this point, and that is The Dark Between Stars by Atticus. I will say this is not my favorite book of poetry by Atticus, but I did still really enjoy this. I always tab the heck out of Atticus's poetry collections, and this one was no different. There's some really wonderful short poems in here, some really incredible deep lines in here. The way his collections are put together with different bits of photography and some poems that are handwritten versus typed up, I just always really enjoy what I read in his collections, and I gave this 3.5 out of 5 stars. Again, not my favorite collection by him, but still very good, and I will read anything that he puts out. And that is it for the books that I read in January 2024. Overall, I feel like I had a very good reading month in January. I was very excited to have a 5-star read, to have several 4.5-star reads. And as a part of the way that I'm putting my reading journal together, I decided that as part of my recap pages for each month, I am actually going to put together my top 3 books that I read that month. And so I only had one 5-star read in the month of January, which was the Atlas Complex. So this was definitely my favorite book that I read in January, but I had several 4.5 out of 5-star reads. And I would say that it was close, but my second favorite book I read this month was definitely The Bullet Swallower by Elizabeth Gonzalez James. Again, this one was just absolutely fantastic. Highly recommend it. And then I would say that my third favorite book that I read this month was Powerless by Lauren Roberts. Really enjoyed the story and definitely can't wait to continue with this series. And that's going to be it for today's video. If you have read any of these books and want to chat about them, please don't hesitate to put your spoiler-free thoughts down below. If you're interested in any of these books, I do always have my Amazon favorites linked down in the description box. That is an affiliate link. And if you go on to my Amazon favorites, you're going to see that I have a whole section of books that I would recommend. I also always have a separate section with all of the books that are on the current month's TBR. I don't usually update that until my TBR video releases here on YouTube, but that's always there on my Amazon favorites if you're ever interested in any of the books that I talk about. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and as always, everyone, please be safe. Bye-bye.